Good evening and good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. We have the wonderful Phil Jones with us today. How are you doing, Phil?
Oh, I'm doing fine. Nice to be here. Thanks, Alex.
No, thank you. I was really looking forward to this for quite a while. You emailed me and said, "Hey, let's talk about this, raising kids in Scientology and Scientology schools." And I thought, absolutely, that's a really valuable conversation. And it's the first time I've had you on the channel, I think.
One of the reasons I wanted to talk about the schools is I know we've touched on it a little bit here and there, but I thought it'd be an interesting subject to cover because we have personal experience. Our kids, that's pretty much the only schools they went to, and just what our experience was with that. I thought would be good to bring out.
Yeah, and there's a lot of resonance, I think, between your story and mine as well, because you correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is you joined Scientology when you were 16, right? There was a
Right.
Truth About Drugs campaign or something, and they kind of sucked
Yep.
you in that way. And
Yep.
it's the same with me. I was 15 when I first did my personality test, 16 when I kind of just started doing courses, and it's a very vulnerable moment in your life, and
Yeah.
that's when Scientology loved to swoop in. And luckily, I left before. I was still a teenager when I left, but I could totally see myself living a life, raising kids in Scientology, sending them to schools. And I'm lucky I got out when I did, but I see a lot of resonance in your story and mine. And I think it's important to talk about that.
Yeah, I probably took that road the wrong way, but and getting the kids into schools. I mean, of all the stuff that probably, I mean, regret's a tough one to fight off, but of all the things, that is probably the most difficult, is raising the kids in the Scientology environment and having them end up in the Sea organization.
Mm.
But as far as Scientology schools go, we ran into it early. Like our kids were very, very young. Um, Back, I guess it was early 80s, maybe 1980, 81, somewhere in there. We had just moved back into Toronto and near Scientology, and probably that period of time, during the 80s is probably the most hardcore Scientology we were in. And that was the time when um, uh, we ended up getting our kids into school. Now, just to give a little bit of basic on this, what is a Scientology school? Um, a Scientology school is a Scientology organization. They're run the same as a Scientology organization, a local org. They have an org board where they have their executive director, they have their training people, which they call supervisors. They have a qualifications division for corrections if someone doesn't get through their studies. They have an ethics officer, the whole bit. They have everything, and they apply Hubbard study technology where they clear misunderstood words. They have play demos. And they even use e-meters. I know some schools, they had sort of a alternate e-meter that they called the Learning Act or Learning Accelerator. It was basically an e-meter, but in a different shape. Uh,
No.
oh yeah, they had those for years. I don't know if you can still get them, but um,
Wow. I had no idea.
oh yeah, because they weren't allowed to really, because the the e-meter after the 60s when Scientology was raided and the FDA, anyway, they raided Scientology, U.S. government, and they seized all the meters, and so they had to list them as a religious artifact. And the schools didn't want to be, they wanted to sort of look at least like they weren't connected to the church. So they came out with this learning accelerator, which was not but it's the same. You have to pick up the cans, does exactly, it's got the meter on it and the whole bit. And they use those for word clearing. So if a student was not progressing, they'd have them pick up the can, sit them on the meter and say, well, in your materials, what word didn't you understand? And then they track it all down or whatever that way. Um,
Wow.
so, and they didn't have teachers, they had supervisors, and those supervisors were all trained at Scientology organizations and how to supervise a Scientology course. They had no actual teacher training. Occasionally, you'd hear of somebody who did previous to their staff at a Scientology school, but mostly they were just supervisor trained, which could be just a matter of weeks or so of training in a Scientology organization, and then they would in the course room, they would have check sheets where they have all the materials listed out of what they're going to study, like history, and they go, okay, well, here's all the different parts they're going to study, and they would just run the kids through the check sheet. And now a lot of the supervisors, they didn't even have high school education. They were just whoever they were, Scientologists typically who had done the supervisor course and were hired by the schools. And and that's kind of how the Scientology schools ran.
Yeah.
Scientology schools are probably one of the biggest Sea Org recruitment pools in the world.
Yeah.
All those second generation uh, Sea Org people, often they came out of Scientology schools, whether it was Delphi in Oregon or some of the local schools. Um, Clearwater has a Delphi now. It used to be called True School, and they've got Clearwater Academy, Washburn Academy. There's a bunch of them in Clearwater. So going back to our original story from the 80s when we had moved into Toronto, we were kind of got back into the mix. We were living in a community, like this townhouse complex, and it was almost all Scientologists. And my sister and her husband lived there, and all most of the others, they were all uh, guardian's office people. So we were kind of in the middle of that mix. But one of the Scientologists there, she ran a school called an Apple School. And back then, the whole idea was that if you put your kids in a public school, they're going to have psychiatric influence. And to a Scientologist, that's like garlic to a vampire, or it,
That's a good analogy, yeah, because
it's
that's one of the things that CCHR and Scientology as a whole push a lot on its parishioners, is that if you send kids to normal schools, they will be, taken up by the psychiatrist, practically force-fed medications for things like ADHD, which
yeah,
Scientology claims is not a real disease or problem. They don't believe in mental health, and so in order to protect your child from these evil psychiatrists and being force-fed medications, it would be best to send them to a private school that's run by Scientologists that will look after them and make sure they don't fall into this trap. That's kind of how it's positioned, right?
exactly. In fact, when our kids were that age, one of them was in kindergarten, and we went in to talk to the vice principal, and he was a trained psychologist, and he said, I'm an expert in behavior modification techniques. And for us, that was like, we're out of here, buddy. Like, because as Scientologists, there's just no way.
Mm.
So anyway, the first thing we did, we tried to put them in a different public school, but we were getting this constant thing of, yeah, but there's drugs, there's all sorts of things they're going to get into in public schools. It's just going to end badly. Drugs and violence and sex and everything was going to be bad. So we ended up putting them into the Apple School, the local school. It was a small school. She ran it out of, I think, the basement of a local church, and we put the kids in there. I can't remember how much it cost, but my wife ended up working there just to offset the cost of it. And we were there for, I guess we lived in that area for about 7 or 8 years. And then we moved to Florida, and um, we there was, at the time, one of the main schools there was True School, which eventually became a Delphi, which meant that they later on took the curriculum from Delphi, Oregon, and licensed out from there. One other point on the schools as a general thing is that they're all under the auspices of Scientology International. I think it's under ABLE, is it?
Abel, yeah.
Which is a Scientology entity in the international, and then all these schools pay a fee up to that up to sign into Scientology. So they are really run by Scientology. I mean, they'll say that, oh, they're just licensing the technology, the Hubbard study technology, but really they're a Scientology entity.
Yeah.
And and True School was very much so in that too. So When we were first living in Clearwater, um, my wife was offered a job working as a supervisor because she had been supervisor trained when we were in Toronto and on staff in our early days. She was a trained supervisor, so they said, "Oh, we'll pay you $500 a week." We go, "Oh, yeah." Back then, and like, what's that, 35, 40 years ago, that was pretty good, especially work. And then also, we'd have our kids in the school for free. 3 kids for free, not bad. After a short period of time, it was like, okay, well, we can only afford 300. Then it went to 135. Then it went to nothing, and then it went to us paying. And it was gradual kind of thing
Mm.
over the years. And but the thing is, I was working pretty hard during that time. That was during the 90s, and when we first got to Clearwater, it was like we got to a whole new country, starting from scratch. Um, and it was a bit of a struggle at first, and I was working pretty hard, so I wasn't really paying that much attention as far as the school went. But 2 of our kids didn't do too bad there socially, but apparently the executive director just took a disliking to one of our kids. And in Scientology, they do have ethics, Scientology ethics, which uh, sounds like, okay, you want to handle a kid's misbehaving or whatever, but in Scientology, there's no rewards and penalties. It's all penalties. It,
Hmm.
if you're bad, you get penalties, and they might put you on doing physical labor. They put you in lower conditions and all of that stuff. But there's no reward if you're doing well. It's just you
I
know.
think, yeah, the ethics system is, in my opinion, one of the most abusive parts of Scientology, because it's something that can be so gradual, and you don't notice that it's coercive or manipulative. Like when you first join Scientology, or when you're not fully devout, you might be a public rather than a staff member, or a SEAL member. And so ethics just sounds like things that you can apply in your life to help get your statistics up and therefore have a better performing business, or how to handle an upset, or whatever it might be. But when you actually study it and you apply it as it is written, it is nothing but harmful, in my
Right.
opinion. And
Yeah.
I called Greenfields out on this. Greenfields is the Scientology school here in the UK. So it's similar to Delphi and Clearwater Academy and all of these. It's independent of the church. It's run. The lawyer who's Scientology's lawyer is actually the head of the board of trustees for Greenfields. So there's definitely a link there. But on paper it's separate, and they say, oh, we apply study technology and Scientology ethics and so on. But I found out from an inside source that every pupil at the school, whether they're a Scientologist or not, has an ethics folder, and they are CS'd by St.
Yeah.
Hill, even though if you're a Scientology kid, you'll be sent to St. Hill for ethics handling. But if you're not a Scientology kid, you'll still have to do ethics tech, do lower conditions and all of this, but just within the school rather than it being a religious thing,
Yeah.
because they have to keep that separation. But that's one of the most harmful things, because if you mess up, you make a mistake, or you don't apply study tech properly, you read a word you don't understand and you start yawning and you refuse to look it up. Something as simple as that could get you doing like hard manual labor, and
Yeah.
that's the sort of
Yeah.
treatment that's not okay to impart on children.
Yeah, on top of the fact that sometimes that what you're getting punished for are just these really ridiculous minor infractions that are
Mm.
normally somebody would say, look, just, or sit down and have a talk with them or something. They just don't do that. They won't actually sit down and talk to them, find out, what's going on. They will just apply the conditions and say it's like a one size fits all kind of thing. And for one of our kids, it was over the years. I could see that it definitely had a negative effect on him,
Mm.
quite a bit actually. So,
Did you
uh,
notice that at the time, though, or is it only since leaving, looking back on it, that you realized it was having a negative impact?
well, we noticed he was having some issues, but I didn't attribute it to that because you don't
Mm.
think that way. You've got in Scientology, it's all this double think. It's like, well, it can't be Scientology; it must be something else. And at the True School, there was, I don't know if you know Mace Kingsley, where they audit children. Carol Kingsley had an office at the True School in the second floor, and kept wanting to audit one of our kids. We never took her up on it. So, which probably, thankfully, who knows how
Mm,
much worse things might have gotten at that point.
yeah.
But one other point of clarification: Scientology schools are for Scientology public, not Sea Org. These are for people who are in Scientology. Sometimes they one of the somebody might be on a local organization staff and have one of their kids or two of their kids, whatever, in a Scientology school. But if that happens, usually the other spouse might be working and making some decent enough money to be able to support them in the school. But typically, it's for public Scientologists. Um, there are some schools that do have sometimes non-Scientology students in there. Not that often. I think a lot less now than they used to. Now that the word is getting out that these schools are Scientology, and people
Well,
don't have much to do with it.
yeah, I think that that's an interesting point because, and I don't know whether this is the same over in the States or any, in Canada, if there are any Scientology schools there, but in the UK specifically, um, when I was in Scientology, Sea Org members weren't allowed to have children, but there were still kids who had Sea Org parents because they were born before the ban came in place. So they had the cadet org for Sea Org children, and it was a separate school, if you can call it that, but it was at the same place that's the Sea Org birthing, Walsh Manor down in Crowborough. So anyone who would have been 14 or something at the time, who was just coming up to finishing their schooling at the age of 16, who had Sea Org kids, would have been in some sort of Scientology school, but it's effectively the cadet organization. They're treated like Sea Org members, but children. And as soon as those kids reached school leaving age of 16, they closed that school down because Sea Org members were no longer allowed to have kids. If you got pregnant, you had to leave the Sea Org or get rid of the baby, which is, again, a really horrible thing to do to a person. But just going on to your non-Scientology students point, Greenfields in the UK is struggling financially because there's simply not enough Scientology public sending their kids to this school for them
Yeah.
to be able to afford to carry on. So they'd be doing mass marketing campaigns abroad, and they actually got visa granting status. So they were trying to appeal to particularly Asian students who have no idea what Scientology is, appealing to their parents, going, you can go to a private English school and get the best education in the world. They would charge them ridiculous amounts of money because you can charge higher fees for international students. And they would come to this school, be on the other side of the world from their parents, and have no idea what they've walked into. They've luckily had their visa status taken away from them, so they can't have international students now. But for a long period of time, that's what was funding them, not the Scientology students. They were actually a minority at Greenfields for a period.
I think that a similar, well, I don't know if it's been taken away, but I know that in Florida, I think it was the Washburn Academy Scientology school, was bringing in these students and their sports team. They were bringing all these kind of ringers from overseas, and their sports teams were doing really well. Now, for some of the sports teams now, some of the leagues locally uh, don't accept them on the leagues anymore because they're Scientology, which is
That's great.
fine if that's what they want to do. I let
Wow.
them.
Yeah.
Now, as we went along and the kids were in school, the school, when they got older and they were kind of getting close to, uh, I guess, finishing 15, 16 years old, uh, I started to pay a little more attention at that point because things that, I'd been working for some time. We were getting settled a bit more. And I started to look at um, when the kids were going to graduate. And the one thing I discovered was almost none. In fact, I couldn't find one student that had graduated high school out of true school. There were a few that ended up going to public school to finish or did their GED, but and I went to the executive director. I said, nobody's graduating here, or they get pulled into the C organization, or they just drop out. But none of them were finishing high school, and I was almost ready to put them in. Put the kids in public school at that time, but they were getting at an age. I guess I can't remember the age they were at, but anyway, it ended up not happening that way, and they stayed in the school for a while longer. but none of the kids ended up getting a high school education from being
Wow.
in Scientology schools their whole lives. And so, that didn't work out. Just a little side note here.
Yeah.
That's our two kids right there.
There we go. I was going to bring that up actually. I wanted just the audience to understand too, because I've not had you on the channel before. So, and you've been around a lot longer than I have in this space. And so people probably know, but there might be some people that don't know your story. And you have two children who are adults now that are still in the Sea organization, and you haven't spoken to them in years,
Over
like
10
over
years. Over 10
decades,
years. Yeah. We
over
have one
10
other
years.
son who
Right.
didn't go in the Sea Org. Almost. He was at Celebrity Center, and the contract was in front of them, and they were wanting him to sign, and he almost signed it. And he called me up. He said, "Dad, I'm not sure." I said, "Go to the airport." We were in Florida, living in Florida. I said, "Go to the airport. There'd be a ticket waiting for you there. I don't care how you get to the airport, bus, car, hitchhike, whatever." And he flew home, and he never ended up doing
Wow.
Scientology anymore after that.
Wow.
So,
But
yeah,
that's something that you have to live with, that they
yeah,
became so indoctrinated,
yeah,
as you were at one point, as I was at one point, like when you put your children into a Scientology school, you didn't do so with malice or knowledge that they would be abused or they would ever have to disconnect from you. You did that because you thought genuinely that this was going to offer them the best opportunity in life, because
oh
that's the
yeah,
Scientology headspace, right?
100%. Well, I mean, that's the whole thing we were talking about keeping them away from the psych influence, the drugs, the everything else, all the crime, and the violence or whatever that might. That's what we were told and we believed. And in the early days, in our early gullible days, whatever we want to call it,
Mm,
that's what we believed. We thought we were doing the best for the kids. We really did, and we were willing to pay the school for that. So, and keep them in there to keep them safe. If and that was our thinking, that even if their education wasn't as great as we thought it might be, we were still keeping them in a safer environment, and that was
mm,
our reasoning.
mm.
And it was all wrong, um, but that
Well,
was what we were
you
thinking.
yeah, and you as a Scientologist have been lied to at so many levels. Like there are so many layers to this. It's a deep thing when we talk about like Scientology as a whole, anyway. But particularly with education, the belief is that education isn't really that important because Scientology technology is what's going to make a real difference on planet Earth. So they're telling you over years and in little bits here and there, kind of ingraining into your mind that the normal education system that most people go through, yeah, sure, it helps people and they get an education, but what's the value? Because it doesn't teach you real skills like auditing, which can actually change people's lives. Like that's how it's kind of pitched to you. But when you've
That,
been in for a long period of time, that's just your mindset. So you think even if they don't get a GED, they're going to have a Scientology upbringing, which is going to help them, right?
and that's the pitch. But if you
Mm.
boil it all down, they just want the free labor or the money.
Yeah, yeah.
They want someone to start their own business and make a ton of money, and you see it all the time in Scientology circles where they're all going for the fast buck, the multi-level marketing and the sort of sometimes scammy kind of businesses occasionally, not always, but often, and um, but or join the Sea Org for free labor. So I mean, they'll convince you. Like when our kids went in the Sea Org, they were promised that they could finish high school there. Well, that's what we were told. We go, oh well, at least they're going to finish their high school education. And I mean, they were adults at the time, so but we thought, well, okay, well, at least they'll have high school that they can fall back, but never, not not one bit of it. After once they were in, they were in, and they were working away, and that was the end of that.
Yeah.
And yeah, and the thing on the disconnection you mentioned earlier, 100%, that would never entered our mind that that would ever happen to us, that our kids would disconnect from us, and we would never have disconnected from them. They were a lot more indoctrinated than we were because um, having been in the Sea Org by that time, I guess probably 10 years by the time they disconnected from us, they'd already been in the Sea Org at least 10 years or more. We were always mostly, except for the really early days, early 70s, we were public for the most part. all our lives in Scientology, and somewhat fringe. And so when we were told we had to disconnect from friends who had left Scientology, let alone family, we just refused to do it. And that's what ended up getting us declared. We just wouldn't go along with any of the disconnection stuff. You know, we knew this family that we'd known for 25 years, and we were told, you need to disconnect from us. That they're a nice family. We've known them for 25 years. I'm not gonna. You can't tell me who to be friends with and not
Yeah.
friends with. So that's what got us kind of. That was the sort of the straw that got us caught up. We were under the radar for a while at that time, but still.
But it's hard with especially when you have family ties, because
Yeah.
even if you knew about, I don't know how much Scientology, how many years had you been in Scientology when you sent your kids to a Scientology school in the first place, roughly?
That's a really good question. So that would have been uh, 12 years, maybe 11, 10
Okay.
to 12 years, somewhere in there.
So you have a pretty solid understanding of Scientology ethics, the disconnection policy, even if you hadn't necessarily applied it. It's
I'd never heard
possible
of yeah,
you'd
I'd
never
never
even
heard of
heard of it.
disconnection.
Right.
Never
So
heard of
so
disconnection at that
so
point.
it doesn't
Yeah.
even cross your mind that something like this could happen, and you've got all of these lovely people taking your money and saying, yeah, look, you can do this course and it will lead to a better life, and your kids can do this course, they can become auditors or whatever it is they promised you, because
Yeah.
that's how Scientology works, with the gaslighting and the false hope and the false
Yeah.
promises. So when they come and tell you all of these lies about the psychs and so on, and scare you from putting your kids into a public school, it's almost like you're left with no option but to put your kids into a Scientology school if you really care about them.
If you care about them, that's the
Yeah.
reasoning. And I would look at Scientology public who would put their kids in public school, and I'd shake my head. I go, why would they put them in that environment?
Yeah.
What about, and then, but now I look, those kids are doctors. I mean, they're like,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
yeah,
But you're sheltered. You didn't see
yeah,
that at the time,
no,
because
not at
for
all.
even if they were doctors and police officers or civil servants or whatever, yes, they're respected jobs. But for a Scientologist, the real job that makes a difference is a staff member or an auditor or someone that's
Yeah,
applying
yeah,
Scientology.
that's the view,
Yeah.
100%. So, um, there were the whole environment in the school. I mean, it was tough to maintain because the cost was quite a bit. I mean, once the pay dried up as far as my wife working there, and then we had to start paying for it, supporting 3 kids, and my wife wasn't working. Well, she was working at the school, but not making anything really. So it was difficult to keep them in the school that long. So it I mean, I look back at how it would have been different if we would have put them in public school and my wife would have been working. Mind you, on the other hand, being in Scientology, they would have probably drained all the money out anyway. I was always a saver. Um, I would always like to save money, but anytime that ever got out, whatever, my brother-in-law at the time, he was what they call a field staff member for Scientology, which is basically a registrar who is not on staff. And
That
anytime
earns
he found
commission from anything that you spend as well.
exactly, exactly, and I know I mean, he found out that I had some money saved, and he tried to convince me to pay. I said, no, no, no. And then eventually he convinced me to loan it to him to buy some auditing with, that he would pay me back. And I thought, well, at least I'll get it back. But when you get it back, it never goes back into savings. It goes back into supporting your life.
Jeez.
So
Yeah.
it always got drained. And then if you go to an event, you have to buy the new lectures for, $3,000 or $2,200. And you can't leave without buying something. There
Mm.
at Flag, you go to an event and the doors are blocked. The registrars stand in front of the doors. You can't leave unless you have an invoice in your hand or a pack of lectures that you bought uh, for whatever price.
Yeah.
Uh,
The you
and
know the
otherwise, you can't leave.
the moment I turned 18, I had a flag reg on the phone to me saying, you've turned 18. That means you can get a credit card now, right? So you can buy your basics. And I'm there thinking, well, yeah, it would be good to own the basics, but I'd like to go to university. That's an option, and if I do that, I'm going to need money to pay for my living expenses, and it would be good to get like a credit score anyway, in case I ever want to get a mortgage or anything. But I don't want to take out a credit card and then just spend it all straight away on my basic. But that's what I end up doing anyway, and it was from day one. It's just if you let them know that you have any amount of savings or access to cash, they'll grab it up.
They're relentless at it,
Mm,
relentless. And to a degree, the schools are the same. Oh, you need these materials. You got to pay for those materials. You got to pay for this. Oh, this whatever. I mean, it was anything in Scientology, it's going to cost,
mm,
and they're just relentless on taking the money. And I mean, if you have any access, I mean, I remember when my mother passed away, and all of us kids got a nice, not a lot, but a nice little chunk of money. And so my brother and my sister immediately spent it all in Scientology, and I had mine in savings. And so a couple of months later, my brother phones me up and he wants some of mine. I said, no, oh no,
wow, jeez. Well,
I don't think so.
I want to talk a little bit about cognitive dissonance because
Yeah,
you mentioned we've talked about how Scientology lie to you and try and convince you that the Scientology upbringing is the way to raise your kids, and sending them to a normal school would be dangerous. But obviously, but what was your upbringing like? Because you weren't raised in Scientology, so you didn't go to a Scientology school, so you would have
no.
had your own experience going to a public school. And was there ever a point where you looked at that and thought, well, my upbringing was okay, or it wasn't okay? I don't know. Like, how did that come into play when you decided to send your kids to school?
Um, yeah, that's a good question. I grew up going to public school, but it wasn't necessarily easy for me. I was always a little bit socially inept and very awkward, shy. I had to fight that my whole life, and it was very, very difficult. And I was a swimmer at the time in high school, and I wore glasses, and that was difficult being a swimmer because I couldn't see that well in the pool area. Um, and and then communicating with girls at the time in high school was difficult for me. So when I read uh, about Dianetics, have it, where you can have perfect eyesight, I thought, you know what, and the whole thing on communication courses, that's kind of what sold it for me. At the time, that's what I wanted. That's what I got in for. Some people get in because they want to help the planet and society and all that. I got in for two things. One is perfect eyesight, and the other is to be able to communicate better and to be able to talk to basically talk to girls. I was about 15 years old and 16 years
Sure.
old almost. So, and that's what did it. So as far as when the kids got in, though, I think by that time we had been sort of more indoctrinated into the whole idea of public schools. And back when I was in school, there were drugs and stuff there, but um, except for me and another guy, nobody else did drugs. No, I'm kidding. I was I was one of the ones that maybe dabbled a little.
Mm,
And that's actually how I ended up getting into Scientology, because there was that we were coming out. I was with a bunch of my friends. We were at a hockey game at the community center at middle of winter time. We're coming outside. It was really cold and snow on the ground, and there was a bulletin board just at the front door there. And I had already kind of walked past, and one of our friends was reading the bulletin board, and he saw this notice for a drug lecture from Narconon. And and I said, "No, I don't, we don't want to go." So anyway, it was sort of a couple of us thought, well, we'll go there and make fun of them or whatever, or just for kicks. You're a teenager, you want to go for kicks and see what they have to say. So that's how we ended up going to this Narconon lecture. And I mean, I remember sitting through that lecture when I was in high school and thinking, I didn't understand any of it. He was talking about, because back then they didn't have the purification rundown of the stuff they do at Narconon these days. He talked about, uh, he was talking about auditing the guy. There were two of them, a guy and a girl. I remember their names. I remember them quite clearly. But he was talking more about uh, handling losses and stuff, like somebody loses their dog. That's what they call a secondary in Scientology, like where underneath that there's what's called an engram, a painful moment, past life, earlier. So he was trying to explain this to the audience, and there were quite a number of adults there. Not we were like maybe 3 or 4 of us students, but and somebody stood up and they said, "Well, why not just get him a new dog if he loses his dog?" And the guy, the Scientologist, couldn't understand that. So, well, no, but we're talking about the emotional. Well, yeah, we'll just get him a new dog. and, and so it didn't go.
That's
The
hilarious.
lecture, oh, it was actually quite funny to listen to this parent stand up and say, "Well,
Yeah.
he lost his dog. What are you talking about going earlier similar to us earlier
Just
similar?
get a
He
new
never had
one.
a
Yeah.
dog earlier. Get a new one. Get a new dog." So
Wow.
so anyway, the whole thing we kind of it was still a big chuckle to us at that point
Mm.
because we didn't understand what the guy was talking about. But they had food afterwards and we were teenagers, so we stayed for the food. And that's when the two Scientologists started talking to us about Scientology. And that's when kind of some of the buttons or the things that had been sort of sitting in my head, they started to go, oh yeah, well that'll handle that, it'll handle that. And these guys, Scientology, the one thing they sell is certainty.
Mm.
uh, you know it's like any cult or heavy duty religion, is they have a lot of certainty. Ours is the way, it will do that, oh yes, 100%, 100% it'll do that. So when you hear the certainty that of things that you are looking to handle, and it was like, yeah, there's a step by step thing where you'll get to a point where you'll handle all of that and yada yada, and so I at that point I was willing to look at it more, at least. But I
Mm.
think at that point I was almost sold on it from that viewpoint of the
Yeah.
certainty they were saying step by step to get to the point of handling those things that I wanted to handle.
Yeah, because Scientology, I describe it often as when you're in Scientology, it's not just a way to help people or do whatever. It's the only way. There's no
Right.
room for,
Yeah.
interpretation or trying it and doing different things. Like when you are indoctrinated to believe LRH is tech, you fully believe that it's the only thing that will salvage mankind. And the reason I asked you for that little backstory there is because I think it positions it really well with where you put your kids into a Scientology school. It's not like you just joined Scientology. You had been manipulated and lied to
Right.
for like
Yeah.
15, 16 years, right?
Yeah.
Before you
Well,
had kids at
yeah.
that stage. So
Yeah.
it's not like overnight you've heard about this Scientology thing and heard about these abuses and then think, oh great, I'll send my kids there. Like you have been tricked, lied to, and deceived for a substantial period
Right.
of time
Yeah.
to believe that this is the only way of helping
Yeah.
your kids. So it's a no-brainer when Scientology tell you that normal schools are full of drug addicts and it's psychs and it's going to be horrible. You're not going to question it. You're going to send your
Right.
kids to the Scientology
Yeah. And
place.
that was the time we were most indoctrinated
Mm.
in the 80s when we first put the kids in there. Um, During the 90s, we didn't, once we moved to Florida, um, as close as we were to Flag, we never did any services there in 25 years. They did
Wow.
one 2-hour course on how to handle your money or something like that, which never did anything. I almost got declared from that, by the way. I went and did this little course. Well, not maybe I'm not declared, but what happened was it was like an afternoon course, what they call a Div 6 course, where it's like just like an introductory thing on how to improve your finances or something like that. And it had some of the Hubbard financial policies on and conditions and stuff like that. Well, at the end of the course, there's practical, it's like, okay, now you have to apply it. Well, their idea of applying it is a demo kit or a clay demo. My idea of
I
applying it was,
thought you were going to say, now apply it. Donate for your next course.
yeah, really. Well, almost, but my idea of applying it was, okay, and I told him this. I said, okay, I'll be back in a week or two. I'm going to go out and try it in my life and see if this handles my finances. No, it's Thursday morning. Thursday at 2 is our week ending. You're gonna attest to completion of this course.
Mm.
So you need to just demo it, do a clay demo or something, or whatever. I said, no, I gotta, well, give me like a day then. No, that's not good enough. You gotta a test by Thursday. Well, give me a couple of hours. I don't care. They wouldn't do it. They sent me to ethics. They sent me
Wow.
to the ethics officer, and they were going to have me do like whatever. And if I would have pursued it, I may have gotten declared for pursuing it and saying, no, I'll
Jeez.
be back in a few weeks. So I just want to see if this works and improves my finances. Anyway, I ended up doing a clay demo or something and then leaving. And then I never went back to Flag and ever did a course there again. So,
Wow.
but we were still indoctrinated. We still thought of ourselves as Scientologists for some years after that.
And
So,
did you find yourself, because I found myself in this place in Scientology a lot, like making a lot of excuses for myself. Like prime example, when I was locked in a room, held against my will, forced to do an OW write up, it was a horrible experience. I wasn't sat there thinking this is great. I was crying my eyes out. And after that experience, it was still upsetting to look back on, but I kind of justified it in my mind and I made up excuses. I was like, oh, maybe, that guy just wasn't applying it correctly, or maybe it wasn't done in the right way and I should give them another chance, because if it was done correctly, I should be raised on the tone scale rather than locked in. Like, that doesn't sound like what Scientology is meant to be. Did you find yourself making similar sort of
oh,
excuses?
100%.
Mm,
One instance when I was at St. Hill and I was on OT3, one of the things you have to do is you have to have your materials when you leave the auditing room. You have to have your materials in a briefcase, locks spun, and the briefcase tied to your wrist as you go to the examiner. Which the examiner is basically you sit on an e-meter and your needle's floating and all
mm.
that. So what happened was one day I did all that, but forgot to spin my locks. Got to the examiner. Oh, forgot to spin the locks. Oh, straight to ethics. Treason. They gave me treason for not spinning my lock. Even just walking for like what? How many yards? 30
Wow.
yards to the examiner, and
In the
forgetting
same
to spin the
building,
locks. Well, yeah,
or
same
was it
building, but you
across
have
the
to go
street?
outside. Yeah, you have
Right.
to kind
Okay.
of go outside and into the next door
But
over.
still, that's nuts.
Nuts. Anyway, I got treason. I was doing manual labor and conditions and over withhold write-ups and stuff like that. But in my head, the same was what you're talking about. I was justifying, say, well, we have to be able to take full responsibility for our actions. So maybe this is going to help me because I need to be able to take full 100% responsibility for my actions. No mistaking no forgetting to spin my locks anymore. That's me. That's on me. It's like, but I mean, the what treason is you got normal is like when you're just going along doing normal, and you got above there's affluence and
Affluence.
power.
Mm.
Below a normal, you've got emergency and danger and liability and
Doubt.
non-existence and enemy and treason. That's how
Mhm.
low they put me in just for not spinning my locks. Treason is like betrayal after trust. We trusted you. And I was doing mest work at St. Hill. One of the things, funny side note, one of the things that I was tasked with doing was there was this whole stack of materials that I had to shred. And the shredder was broken. So I fixed the shredder. I rebuilt the shredder for them. And I was shredding these materials, and the CS said, don't read any of it, because it was like waist high stuff. I read everything. I was reading through this stuff. Okay, I was reading it and reading it and reading it. I didn't blow up or I didn't burst into flames or anything.
You didn't get
But
pneumonia and die then, because that's what they tell you if you
I,
read confidential materials
I
without.
didn't even get a sniffle. I was really excited to read it, but it was like back then I was and I thought, oh, this is
Yeah.
kind of interesting, whatever.
Mm.
But I was a bit of a rebel the whole time. My whole tenure in Scientology, I
Yeah.
was always rebelling against this and that. And it's amazing I never got declared a number of times. I fought against things in Toronto and in the early days. I was I can tell stories. I was so close to being declared so many times, but
Well,
didn't.
I think.
And it would have been good if I did. Anyway,
Well, I think you're probably declared now, Phil. I'm sure.
I'm pretty sure at this point they've got
But
my number.
I think what's really promising about your story is you are one of the few people who have left, and it's like a lot of people leave Scientology and choose to go about their life and not think about it, or maybe go to therapy and sort their own head out, but don't speak out publicly about it. And I'm not criticizing people that don't speak out. If you leave Scientology, you don't have to speak out if you don't want to. But there is a lot of power and help, I find, that you can get in speaking out, because you can help others by sharing your story. And you've gone one step further. You haven't just come out and, you know, had to go through that awful experience of disconnecting from your kids, but you've done your utmost to try and like ring the alarm bells and tell the public, hey, this is what's going on. And you organize these billboards to be put up all over. Was it just LA or the whole US where it was kind of calling?
No, we did 2 in LA and 1
Right.
in Clearwater, and then last year we did that one that lasted not very long for the Aftermath Foundation.
Yeah.
I think it, even then, even though it lasted only a day, I think it did have an effect. Scientology freaked out from that when they saw
Mhm.
that billboard up saying, you know, if you need help leaving Scientology,
Yeah.
here's the number to call.
Yeah.
And boy, that's when they put that lift in front of the billboard, and then they got it taken down. But the other
Yeah.
ones, they were up for quite a bit, like
Mm.
a couple of months each. And then we did the one in Florida. At the day that our billboard in Florida went down, Scientology put one of their billboards up on the same spot. Like, you know, hey,
Yeah.
we'll put ours up.
Classic.
Whatever.
But
Yeah.
it's a prime example of, like, you haven't just left and gone about your business. You've tried to shout about it, and there was massive press attention at the time of that billboard campaign. I was reading an article on the Hollywood Reporter earlier about it, and you were saying that when you went for like the unveiling or whatever, you expected there might be a couple of people, and there was like helicopters and camera crews and everything, and it was
Oh
big
yeah.
news.
Oh yeah. It was Inside Edition. There was Good Morning
Mm.
America. Was it morning? Oh, like we were there was we were on all those shows, those main shows. We were, in fact, we were living in Vegas at the time, and the Australian morning show, one of their bigger shows there, set up a studio in Vegas, and we did a live show with them from Vegas for in Australia. And then we were at BBC. We were interviewed, and it went on for months after that, doing radio interviews, TV interviews, huge coverage. But as far as getting out and speaking out, getting out of Scientology and speaking out about it, a lot of it did have to do with our kids. That was our main focus, is just to try to get our kids back. But also on top of that, we came across so many people that had been in the same situation that it became more of a cause for not just us, because we were offered at one time that if we stopped speaking out, that we would be able to have our contact with our kids. See, this is where that's a tough one for me to talk about a little, but uh, one sec.
It's okay. It's difficult.
You know, after all these years, it still hits me on the kids. But there's so many people out there that had a similar, you know, disconnection stories that we just couldn't just drop it. And the other thing too is that I think, just to a degree, anybody that's been in Scientology has supported an abusive cult.
Mm.
And I don't know that I know that not everybody is able to speak out and do something, but as many people who can,
Mm.
it's I think that if nobody spoke out, Scientology would just get away with everything.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you know,
And
that's the way I see it. Was it? We have to just get as many people speaking out as possible, because that's the only way we're
absolutely.
gonna bring it down.
Yeah, the more the merrier.
Yeah.
I think when I was saying that earlier, I meant I didn't want to judge people who didn't want to speak out, but I do want to encourage people to speak out
Yeah.
if they
Yeah.
can and want to.
Yeah.
But just going back to
Yeah.
that point you were saying about your kids, and you do realize that, like, Scientology were lying to you. I don't know the ins and outs of what that deal was, but you know,
Oh, 100%. Oh, they were
Right,
lying. I knew
and
that.
this is that emotional turmoil
Yeah.
that Scientology
Yeah.
has on people for years, even after leaving. Is they find out what is the most upsetting thing or distressing thing. They hold it over your head, and they'll continue to do it even after you leave. That
Yeah.
prime example, David and Becky Fryer. So there's someone called Becky Fryer here in the UK who was a Scientologist, and during the anonymous movement, her father, Anthony or Tony Lee, started speaking out and said, "Get Becky out." He didn't want his daughter joining Scientology, but she was already fully in. He started protesting with the anonymous movement, causing a big storm, got the local member of parliament involved. It was in the news and everything. And Scientology managed to convince Tony that his daughter had been declared a potential trouble source because she wouldn't disconnect from her dad. Therefore, she can't do any servicing, so she's out. And so Tony stopped protesting. After a few months, turns out she hadn't stopped at all. She finished her return program, and now they're completely disconnected. And Becky is the #1 donator to the Ideal All program in the UK. But that's a prime example of how
Yeah.
they will try and
Yeah.
say, cool, well, you have the option, just stop speaking out and you can have your kids again. Even
Right.
that is a lie, because you would
Oh,
have
and
gone along with it and you still would be in the same situation.
and at the time I knew that. When I
Mm,
was on the phone with them, I knew that that was the case. That they would never hold up their end of the bargain
mm,
at all. And even then, you, if you have contact with your kids that when they're in the Sea Org, I look back on the history of when they're in the Sea Org, they get very little time to contact you anyway.
mm,
And if it's a phone call, it's what they call good roads, fair weather only. You don't
mm,
have any time for a real conversation. They won't get into any kind of conversation at all. It's, I'm doing great. Everything's fine. Yeah, I went out and, oh, we went to see a movie last, it's like, there's no real communication anyway when they're in Sea Org, and it's very seldom. And you might, if you're lucky, if they're in the Sea Org, we were living in Florida, they were in California. We would drive out there a couple of times a year, and if we got to see them for an hour or two, we were lucky. And one time though, they got, I think, a half a day or something, and we managed to get out to the beach with them. But I think that was because I was putting a lot of pressure on and saying, what is this? We drove all the way out here, and that I would put pressure on. And then once, when we were still under the radar, and I had set up kind of a family reunion thing with my wife's family and in Canada, and I had paid for the flights for the kids to fly up there, and yep, it was all scheduled. They were all ready to come out. Our son and his wife made it at the last minute. Our daughter, they wouldn't let her go. I mean, that was the excuse that, oh, something came up, I have to handle. But
mm.
I just knew they wouldn't let her go. She's it's tough for them to let her go because she's been where she's worked, she's seen it all. Like, she worked with Miscavige directly, and I think that she's watched pretty closely. So it'd be tough for them to let her go anywhere on her own, I think, at this point.
And I think there's two sides to it as well, of how difficult it is for them, because they're probably being watched closely, and if they wanted to leave, it might be difficult for particularly your daughter to. But there's
Yeah.
also the Scientology upbringing, going to a Scientology school. The indoctrination started so early,
Right.
but
Right.
you didn't realize that at the time. At the time, you thought that you were helping these kids, but actually, what was happening is they were being indoctrinated
Right.
and
Yeah.
groomed by this
Yeah.
coercive group that now have full control over these kids. And
Yeah.
by leaving, you're trying to help them and say, hey, look, it's okay to leave. I'm still here for you if you ever want to leave. And you've done a huge campaign to try and get that message to them. Hey, call me was the message of
Yeah.
that campaign. And the
Yeah.
fact that it hasn't reached them, or if it has, they've been kept from reaching you, just goes to show the absolute control this organization has over its parishioners.
Well, yeah. I mean, the indoctrination goes deep, so deep that when we were on the phone with our daughter, when we were on our way to Clearwater to put up a billboard there, she did mention as one of the criteria for getting contact with the kids again was to stop doing the billboards. So she knew about the billboards.
Right.
Um, but the indoctrination, after
Yeah.
she'd been in for what, 15, 20 years at that point in the C organization, and then from early, she was born into Scientology basically.
Mm,
So and we didn't, like as parents, we didn't really run Scientology on them. I know some parents, you hear these stories about, yeah, they did conditions on their kid, ran conditions on their kids, Scientology ethics conditions, this and that. We never did any of that.
Mm.
We, uh, they had a fair bit of freedom to, do things. We took them, did stuff with them, um, you know, took them camping, this and that. But so we didn't give them, except for the school, we didn't really give them a hardcore Scientology upbringing.
Mm.
So, um, but they had enough of it through the school, and then once they were in the Sea Org, that's where the heavy indoctrination really,
Yeah.
really got in.
And these schools exist to groom kids for the
Yeah,
Sea organization. That's the only reason they exist, is to disseminate the tech and recruit people into like if you look at the majority of staff members at London Org, for example, that I used to work with, they all went to Greenfields. And there was even a note in the Independent Schools Inspectorate, so the people that go and inspect private schools in the UK. I can't remember which year it was. I think it's 2016. The report notes that there's very little or no career advice or training for students at Greenfields, because the majority of students go on to work for the Church of Scientology.
yeah.
So you have that on one hand, but on the same hand, the school, like on the other hand, sorry, the school is saying we're not a religious school. We just apply this non-religious study technology. You can't have it both ways.
No, and I mean, it's run exactly like a Scientology organization with their
Yeah.
organization board and all that. But the other place that some of these students go to if they don't join the Sea Org is because they don't have a lot of education. Often they'll go to work for a Scientology owned company, because there's a lot, especially in Florida and Clearwater area, there are a lot of larger Scientologist owned companies.
Mm.
And I know a number of people that go and end up working there, whether they, I don't know, get administrative jobs, because some of these companies, they operate using Hubbard administrative technology, if you want to call it technology. And a lot of these students coming out of the schools may have studied that administrative technology. So they get scooped up by these companies to be sort of middle management, and some of them do okay, some of them do great, or some of them go on to do their own companies. And but
They just
there are,
further funnel more money into Scientology, right?
and that's exactly what happens. They
Yeah.
go in there, and then because they're working in an organization like a company that's owned by Scientologists, and primarily the employees are primarily Scientologists, not necessarily all of them. There's often pressure for them to get up the bridge, meaning
Mm.
go and buy what are you on next? And I remember when the basic books were redone, and the pressure, if you worked for a Scientology company or Scientologist owned company, uh, have you bought the basics yet? Have you bought the basics yet? It was like constant day and night. Yeah, I get phone calls like 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night. Oh, have you got your basics yet? It's like,
Just
no.
constant pressure.
Constant pressure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
until you give in. And when you do give in, then they move on to the next one. Cool, you've got all your basics.
yeah,
Well, do you have all
yeah,
of your ACCs? Or when are
exactly.
you
Yeah,
going to your next step on the bridge, or whatever it may
right.
be? But
Yeah.
I'm cautious that you've got to run in a minute, because I know we're trying to keep this to an hour. Should we go through some of these comments and stuff I've been
Sure,
starring to
absolutely.
go through?
Yeah.
Shai Corley, thank you so much for joining. She says, thanks for all you do, Alex and Phil.
Oh, thank you.
Mary Kay London saying hi everyone. CC here says 85 to 90 AOLA, which is the Advanced Org Los Angeles, paid out about 2,000 to 3,000 a week for outside childcare and schools. Mace Kingsley, Denningson, Stan Miller, Debbie Swanson's, Hogs Hollow, and many more.
Oh, a note on Cece. She's a good friend. And when we were doing the billboards and protesting in Los Angeles, Cece was part of that, a good part of that. She was the one who came up with the magnetic signs that we used, the call me signs that we stuck on the side of our we had an SUV at the time, and we would drive around Big Blue with these signs on them. And I had a whole stack of them. Cece gave me a bunch of them, and we had them in the back of the car. We had one on each door. And then one day, Scientology security stole one off the side of the car. I drove around the block, stuck another one on, and around we went again. So
Oh, I
yeah,
love that.
they stole it right. But Cece was very much a part of that. A very good friend.
Amazing. Well, thank you for joining us, CC. Witness says, wow, Phil, they gave you false promises. Church of Scientology never delivered on.
Scientology is all about false promises.
Hmm.
All. They've never made it clear. They've never made an OT. Their communication course, the grade 0 Scientology auditing, a person should be able to communicate about anything, any time with anybody. And you go, my brother's grade 0, and you try to talk to him about Scientology and whatever. Nope, sorry, it won't have anything to do with it. So
Total non-confront,
none,
as they say in
all
Scientology.
false promises. Scientology is
Yeah.
full of false promises.
Yeah. Witness also says, I agree, Phil. COS is a threat to the safety of our communities, in my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. I agree.
Matt Pritchard is here. Good to see you, buddy. Long time no see. Thank you for joining. Hi, everyone. Just stopping by. Hope all is well. It's great to see Phil on a live talking about his time with Scientology and his experience with disconnection.
Thank you, Matt.
And Danielle Chamberlain here, another regular viewer. Thank you so much, Danielle. Whilst out as a public member, normal school was great, but at home, my stepfather, who married Jill Van Standen, applied ethics. The Sea Org was obviously worse. And I think that's another thing to note is Scientology schools, you know, can be abusive and harmful and all of this, but it's Scientology as a whole that is harmful. And there are a lot of kids who didn't go to Scientology schools but had harsh hard manual labor and ethics applied at home, or, you know, forced confessionals, you know, sec checks and so on in the home environment without the school being there. And what separates, I think, you from a lot of other Scientology parents, especially with lots of second generation Scientology kids now speaking out on YouTube and such, like, you didn't apply ethics like that at home. And so that sets you apart as a sort of who you are as a person, right? You made sure your kids were safe when they were in your care.
Yeah, I don't even think we ever did like touch assists or anything like that. Maybe there was a thing in Scientology called a contact assist, where if you hurt yourself, you touch the area where you hurt yourself. I might have done a few of those, but a funny anecdote: a friend, we knew this lady who had a couple of kids, and we knew the kids, and she actually was at St. Hill, probably before your time, probably. And her kids went to public schools in East Grinstead, but she would apply Scientology stuff to her kids. And one of her kids told me one day where he had hit his head, and she wanted him to, and I guess this was in the early days of her Scientology. She didn't quite understand a contact assist, meaning just touch it there, touch it there. So he was sitting there on the floor, and he told me this story. I couldn't stop laughing. He was doing this. He said, his mother said, do a contact. And he says, it doesn't feel any better. It doesn't feel any whack. He was whacking his head on the wall.
That's not going to make it better.
No, a contact assist is just touch it there. But she obviously didn't quite understand what a contact assist was. Not quite exactly doing what the motion was when you hurt yourself.
Jeez. I had a similar thing. I think the first time, once I'd learned about contact assists, well, I think I cut my knee or my hat. There was something, like I cut myself somewhere, and I think it was my cat scratched me. And I was like, okay, I'll try this new tech I've learned and just like gently touch it. And my mum was like, Alex, why are you touching it? It obviously hurts because, you know, you've just been cut and there's blood, and like, touching a wound is not going to make it feel better. And I was like, no, trust me, it's going to work. And it didn't. I was like, this is so stupid, but I was convinced it was going to work. So I was like, I'm going to keep doing it and then, you know, you just desensitize.
And yet the double think comes in, because I had that all through my Scientology career. Oh, that didn't work. Conditions didn't work. And I knew that. At one point I said, one thing I know about Scientology is condition formulas don't work, because I've tried them and they don't make any change. And yet still had it in our heads that we were going for the gold, going for the ring, the gold ring. It's just bizarre how.
And then, because there's hope that it's like, okay, well, it didn't work last time, but maybe it's because I didn't do it right, or maybe if I do it in this way, it will work, or like L. Ron Hubbard said it will work, so it will work. There's just something I'm doing wrong because it
Yeah.
didn't work last time. It's
Yeah.
not that the actual principle is flawed.
Yeah, but I actually had that thought of
Yeah.
certain things that were flawed. I mean,
Mm.
when David Mayo was declared, and uh, back in the early days, he was kicked out of Scientology and started his own group. I immediately thought, well, why didn't why didn't Ron know that he had an SP working next to him? There's whole courses on how to spot a suppressive person.
Yeah.
How come he didn't know? He doesn't know. How are we going to know?
Yeah.
Anyway, but we'll go more. We can do more questions. I'm enjoying
Yeah.
hearing from the people. These people are awesome.
Witness here says, yep, double think. It doesn't work. You're doing it wrong. Horrible mental effery, in my opinion.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, 100%.
absolutely. Witness again, in my honest opinion, Church of Scientology is like generational trauma on max cap. It's insidious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When we were doing Good Morning America, the interviewer asked, or he said, he says, well, Scientology says you are attacking their beliefs. And I said to him, I said, well, no, we're not. We're just trying to get our kids back. But in looking back on it, I might have answered that question differently, because the beliefs drive the abuses.
Mm.
It's the disconnection policy. That's part of the belief system. And it's not really a belief system anyway. It's basically Hubbard said it's like a scientifically proven system, applied philosophy. It's not a belief system, but if you take the writings as their beliefs, it's those that drive the abuses anyway. It's like
Yeah.
all the abuses and the fair game and all of that is driven by Hubbard policy.
It's like once you start pulling the string, with the activism that I'm doing, I'm trying to get politicians and so on to separate the beliefs from the behaviors, so that they don't have to be in a position where they rule on what is and isn't a religion,
Right.
what you can and can't believe. And
Yeah.
I say, okay, so for example, if L. Ron Hubbard says disconnection, blah, 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 it's okay to believe that that would work, but actually doing it is harmful. And
Right.
you start pulling the cord and you start having these conversations with people about whether the belief system itself is inherently harmful, because you cannot practice Scientology and actually be a true believer without inadvertently abusing and harming people. But you're not going to fully understand that as a non-Scientologist until you go down that rabbit hole. So I always kind of approach it with a separating beliefs and behaviors, but can you have the belief without the behavior? And I don't think you can.
No, I don't think you can. It'd be like, what if your belief system meant sacrificing babies or something? You go,
Yeah,
well,
that would clearly be wrong, and that wouldn't be allowed. So
right. Well,
why are they allowed to get away with this stuff?
fair game is clearly wrong, and so
Yeah.
is disconnection is clearly wrong. But that's part of their belief system.
Yeah.
I know it's a tough one. We have to kind of walk that fine line a little bit, but
Well,
have to keep it that way for now.
Phil, I know we are now over our allocated time. I would thank you so much for coming on and speaking to me about raising your kids in Scientology schools. I think it was really, really interesting. I would love to have you back, because we haven't even really touched on your time here in the UK at St. Hill. I'd love to do a live stream about that. And, I think this has been fantastic. So thank you.
I was there for 6 months at one time, then back for another short time. Yeah, I'd be happy to go and talk to you about all that.
That'd be great. Anything you want to leave anyone with? Anything you want to say before we wrap up?
I think that's it. We wanted to cover the schools. I think we did.
There we go. Awesome. All right. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Thank you, Phil. And we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, John.